Okay, so welcome to the second video that I've created, this time on Aristotle and causation. As with the first video, this is for OCR Religious Studies Year 1 and AS. Again, I'm going to repeat what I said in the first video, which that this video doesn't replace comprehensive revision, which you'll need to undertake yourself, but provides a general background on Aristotle. Again, it's well worth looking at Aristotle and his particular background. It's not necessary for the exam, but it would be helpful for your studies. Just a word on his background: Aristotle was a pupil of Plato and later went on to tutor Alexander the Great. In terms of difference, we've already seen that Plato was a rationalist. He believed that our thought and our thinking process could allow us an insight into the universe. Aristotle, on the other hand, is described as the first empiricist. Unlike the rationalist method, he believes that observation and experience will lead to truths about the universe. His first sort of radical digression from Plato is that he sees that rather than there are kind of ideal forms, for example, the ideal guinea pig or the ideal hamster, that actually there seems to be some sort of family resemblance, and that there's similarities and differences between the two creatures, and that by observing them, you can come to some conclusions, not only about hamsters and guinea pigs, but also some conclusions about rodents in general. As a result of that, he feels that you can learn things through observation and experience rather than pure rational thought. This is perhaps illustrated when it comes to education. As you'll recall, Plato feels that our knowledge is innate, that over the course of time we've forgotten things, and that knowledge just needs to be remembered. So if you gave a child a violin, for example, they would eventually, if they put their mind to it, learn how to play the violin. For Aristotle, this is very different. He feels that knowledge to play an instrument must be learned and consolidated through practice. In fact, he talks about that, and that's one of the things that people talk about now when it comes to growth mindsets, that people need to practice and continually practice to make improvements. Another idea that Aristotle comes up with is the nature of the four causes. This is a teleological argument. In other words, it basically has an end to it. In the first instance, Aristotle believes that everything has a material cause. Now, if we were to talk about building a house, which is the example we've got here, the material cause is the building materials, the wood, the brick, the electrical cables, etc., all those kind of things. However, if you just piled them up, you couldn't necessarily say that you had a house. Yes, you might have the components of a house or the raw materials, but you don't have a house. So there's something along the lines which needs to be done. The next thing is a formal cause. In this case, building plans. That's going to tell you how to use the particular materials and how you're going to construct the house. The next thing is an efficient cause. In this case, you need someone who can put the material and the formal cause together and actually start creating what it is you intend to construct. So in the case of a house, we need builders, plumbers, electricians, etc. They're the efficient causes. The final cause is the construction of the house. So each of these components is necessary, and each of these components will provide a teleological sense of progression. It'll actually come to a final conclusion. Okay, so if inanimate objects have a final cause, then for Aristotle it seems that humans would also. Aristotle looks at human beings and says, look, they're made up of component parts, just like just like houses. For example, you have eyebrows and eyelashes to keep the dust from your eyes, etc. You have hair because that keeps you warm in the winter, etc. But he actually also believes that human beings as a whole have a final cause. For Aristotle, this is to be a good person. Note that this isn't the same as good in Plato's sense, but good because they display a range of virtues that are seen to be good. Again, you might want to go away and have a little look at Aristotle's virtue ethics, things like the golden mean, and the virtues that he suggests are necessary for a person to be good. Okay. Aristotle then moves on to say, well, if humans, animals, stones, etc., have a final cause, then why not the universe? Surely the universe must have a cause in itself. For Aristotle, the final cause is an everlasting and perfect God. Now, I should say that this is not a God as Abrahamic religions would envisage. So it's not God in the same way as Judaism, Islam, or Christianity would envisage. Aristotle's God, on the other hand, is rather self-centered, contemplating as he does his own perfection. Rather than causing things to happen as a creator, Aristotle's God has an almost magnetic pull, causing movement in the universe. It's really important to note that this kind of idea of the prime or unmoved mover is essentially very different from an argument that you'll find later on, which is by St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas also refers to a prime mover, but Aquinas means that it's someone, a creator, who starts things off, rather than Aristotle's idea that it's someone who already exists and is perfect and basically doesn't do anything apart from contemplate their own perfection. There are subtle differences. For example, praying to Aristotle's God would result in nothing happening. For Christians, you might pray to God because you think that God will intervene somehow. That's not going to happen with Aristotle. Okay, so there are various objections to Aristotle. The first is that modern science would discount many of Aristotle's ideas about causality. Having said that, obviously, Aristotle's philosophy looks very much like the sort of kind of model that we would be comfortable with, far more so than Plato's model. The second thing is that the idea of purpose seems odd when talking about inanimate objects. Yes, it might be the case that humans have a purpose, but a stone or a twig, does that have a purpose? That seems very strange. The next thing is something called the fallacy of composition. Aristotle considers that each part of our bodies has a purpose, and again, that kind of makes sense. We've got eyelashes to keep dust out, we've got feet to help us walk, hands to help us pick objects up, etc. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the whole has a purpose. Now, obviously, he's looking at things, perhaps inanimate objects, like houses, etc., where each component does have a purpose in the overall concept of a house. However, do we have a purpose in life? I don't know. Lastly, the Big Bang Theory would suggest a universe that is explosive and not implosive. So Aristotle's conception of a God who doesn't actually do anything except contemplate their own perfection and has always been there at the same time as the universe seems quite odd. Obviously, later theologians will suggest that we have a universe that is caused by something, and scientists would say that that's the Big Bang. So there are some objections to Aristotle, but as I've said, Aristotle's model appears to be much more acceptable, perhaps to our modern way of thinking, than Plato's.